I was on a mission to get justice for Shanann, Nico, Bella, and Celeste. They deserved to have their story told.
I think about, like, did I cause this?
What in the world is going on?
Hey, are you Chris?
Yes.
A lot of it wasn't adding up.
The disappearance of a pregnant Frederick woman and her 2 children has captured the nation's attention.
This house is not complete without anybody here.
From the outside, the Watts family looked like a picture of modern suburban life. A quiet neighborhood in Colorado, a modest home, and a family that seemed to share every milestone with the world. Chris Watts was soft-spoken, reserved, and often described as dependable. He had a steady job, a wife who documented their life online, and 2 young daughters who appeared in smiling photos and short videos that felt familiar to anyone scrolling through social media. There was nothing about him that stood out as alarming. In fact, that ordinariness was part of what made people trust him. Shanann Watts was outgoing and open about her life, her marriage, and her family. Their relationship, at least publicly, appeared busy but loving, full of routines and plans for the future. Another child was on the way, and the story being told online suggested a family moving forward together. If you're drawn to stories that challenge what we think we know about people, this is a good time to subscribe to the channel, because this case begins exactly where most people stop asking questions. Chris, by contrast, stayed mostly in the background. He didn't speak much, didn't draw attention to himself, and seemed content to let life happen around him. That quiet nature made him easy to overlook, and in many ways, easy to underestimate. There were no public arguments, no obvious signs of chaos. Nothing that suggested the kind of story that would soon dominate headlines. But true crime stories often begin this way, not with warning signs that are impossible to miss, but with lives that feel familiar and safe. The comfort of routine can hide tension, and silence can mask conflict. If you think it's important to understand how these stories really start, take a moment to like and share this video, because the first chapter is always about what people believed before the truth came out. At this point in the story, everything still looked normal. A family, a future, and a man no one suspected. And sometimes, that's the most unsettling part of all. Behind the carefully shared moments and smiling photos, small changes were beginning to take shape. The kind that are easy to miss unless you're looking for them. Chris Watts started to pull inward, becoming more distant and emotionally unavailable, even as daily life continued on the surface. Routines stayed mostly the same, but the energy behind them shifted. Conversations shortened, engagement faded. What once felt like participation began to look more like avoidance. This is where many stories quietly turn, not with arguments that spill into public view, but with silence that grows heavier over time. Chris appeared to go through the motions of work and family life, but those close to the situation would later describe a growing emotional disconnect. Internally, something had changed, and instead of confronting it directly, he chose to keep it hidden. If you're someone who watches these cases to understand the warning signs people often miss, make sure you're subscribed, because this chapter is where psychology matters more than headlines. As weeks passed, the gap between appearance and reality widened. Private decisions were being made without open conversation, and resentment had room to grow unchecked. It's in these moments that pressure builds, especially when someone lacks the tools or willingness to deal with conflict honestly. Rather than addressing dissatisfaction, it was buried, allowed to fester beneath the calm exterior everyone else still saw. From the outside, there was nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms. Life went on, plans were made. The future still looked scheduled and predictable. But predictability can be deceptive. It can create the illusion that everything is under control, even when it isn't. If you believe stories like this are important to share so others can recognize emotional red flags, take a moment to like and share this video. By the end of this chapter, the family's life still appeared intact, but the foundation was no longer stable. What had once been a shared direction was now fractured, and the silence surrounding that fracture was becoming more dangerous than anyone realized. The morning Shanann Watts and her children were reported missing began with confusion and quickly turned into concern. Shanann had returned from a business trip late the night before, and by the next day, there was no sign of her or the girls. Friends noticed immediately that something wasn't right. Messages went unanswered, appointments were missed. The routine communication that had always been there suddenly stopped, and that silence raised alarms. Chris Watts contacted police and spoke publicly, presenting himself as a worried husband and father who just wanted his family to come home. He stood in front of cameras, asking for their safe return, describing them as if they had simply vanished without explanation. On the surface, it looked like a desperate appeal. But for investigators trained to listen closely, the way things are said can matter just as much as what is said. Certain details felt off, not dramatic enough to accuse, but noticeable enough to remember. As police began their work, they focused on timelines, last known movements, and digital activity. Missing persons cases rely heavily on patterns, and in this case, the pattern broke sharply. Shanann's phone, her car, and personal items were still there. There was no evidence of a planned departure. If you're following this story and want to understand how investigations move from uncertainty to focus, make sure you're subscribed, because this is the turning point where facts begin to replace assumptions. Attention naturally shifted toward the person closest to the situation. Chris continued to cooperate, but each answer added more questions. His behavior, his tone, and his explanations didn't fully align with what investigators were finding. This wasn't about suspicion fueled by emotion, but about inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. By the end of this phase, the case had changed direction. What started as a search for missing family members was becoming something else entirely. The performance of concern was no longer enough to hold the story together, and the investigation was closing in on the truth, one detail at a time. As investigators continued to press forward, the gaps in Chris Watts' story became impossible to smooth over. Each interview, each timeline check, and each comparison between statements and evidence narrowed the possibilities. What had once sounded like confusion now felt like contradiction. The more Chris talked, the more his words boxed him in, leaving less room for explanations that could fit the facts. This stage of the case wasn't driven by emotion or public pressure. It was driven by method. Investigators revisited locations, reviewed digital records, and carefully reconstructed movements minute by minute. When stories change, records don't. That contrast became central to everything that followed. If you appreciate seeing how patience and evidence work together to uncover the truth, this is a good moment to like the video and share it, because cases like this show how details matter more than appearances. As questioning intensified, the calm image Chris had maintained began to crack. The version of events he had presented could no longer stand up to scrutiny, and the weight of what investigators already knew was closing in. This was the point where the narrative stopped being controlled by words and started being controlled by proof. Every inconsistency added pressure, and every correction made the situation worse rather than better. Eventually, the investigation reached a point where there was no path forward without confronting reality. The story that had once been delivered confidently was now collapsing under its own contradictions. What remained was not mystery, but clarity, and clarity brings consequences. The case moved quickly from investigation to accountability, as there was no longer any uncertainty about where responsibility lay. By the end of this chapter, The focus was no longer on what might have happened, but on how the legal system would respond. The quiet suburban story had fully unraveled, replaced by a documented chain of events that could not be undone. The final question was no longer about truth, but about judgment, and that judgment was coming fast. When the case reached its conclusion, there was very little left to debate. The legal process moved forward based on evidence, admissions, and a timeline that no longer had gaps. The courtroom was no longer a place for speculation or image management. It was a place where actions carried permanent consequences. The sentence made it clear that what had happened could not be reframed or softened. It marked an end not only to the case, but to the life Chris Watts once presented to the world. The outcome sent a shock far beyond the courtroom. People who had followed the story struggled to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man they had seen in interviews with the reality of the verdict. That disconnect is part of why this case continues to be discussed. If you've stayed with this story through every chapter, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because Death Row Files exists to examine cases like this with care, not sensationalism. What stands out most isn't just the crime itself, but how it developed. This wasn't a sudden break from reality. It was the result of avoidance, secrecy, and the refusal to confront difficult truths. Over time, silence replaced communication, and internal conflict was allowed to grow unchecked. This case shows how ignoring problems doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them space to become more dangerous. If you believe stories like this matter because they help people recognize warning signs and understand consequences, make sure to like and share this video. These narratives aren't about fear, they're about awareness. They remind us that appearances can be deceiving and that accountability is unavoidable. In the end, the Watts case stands as a stark warning, a reminder that living a double life comes at a cost, and that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always surfaces. What remains now is not mystery, but a lesson written in consequences that can never be reversed.